Good morning. We begin the second day of the Gaidar Forum today. We are gonna discuss a new theme, the theme of the wars of sanctions, which has become increasingly relevant. It has been propelled to the forefront recently. More and more often, we have yet another speaker, Mr. Repik. He's trying to get through the cordon, the barriers that have been erected around the academy, but he's going to join us in 5 or 10 minutes. We're not going to wait for him to arrive. I suggest we begin at once. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you the panelists of today. First, Esko, Chair of the Board of East Office of Finnish Industries and former Prime Minister of Finland from 91 to 95. Alexandra Knobel, Director of the Research Center for International Trade of RANEPA. I would call him a host of our today's panel. Alexis Rodzanko, President of AmCham, the American Chamber of Commerce in Russia, and Alexei Repik, President of Business Russia and Chair of the Board of our farm. He's going to join us in 5 to 10 minutes. Trade wars is not something new. If we look back at the history, then we'll see that the first one took place in 1868 or so, when 80% tariffs were slapped by the British Empire on French wine, trying to stimulate the Brits to produce their own wine. But as practice revealed back then, the trade wars initiated by his idea didn't work. Instead of producing wine, the British started to produce gin. And as far as the health of the nation is concerned, the negative effect was seen. So Britain suffered from this initiative. Trade wars are not just related to international trade. Trade wars cover almost all economic aspects, from resources to finance, to human resources, to knowledge, to logistics, because all these are the components of trade wars in the modern world. And there is always one way to initiate a trade war, through introducing sanctions and tariffs. Yet another instrument right now is technologies. Limiting and restricting access to technologies or preventing the transfer of technologies are new instruments that are used in order to influence this or that economy. If we look at what we saw in last year, the biggest thing as far as trade wars are concerned was the confrontation between the US and China. As we all remember, in 2018, two countries slapped tariffs on goods and trade worth more than 200 billion. And only at the G20, the two leaders managed to agree on something in order to put an end to this trade war. But the thing is, this has already resulted in a drop in the trade growth from more than 4% to 3%. And the IMF has revised downwards its forecast as well. Russia has also suffered from the trade wars. Right now, the economy is projected to grow at 1.5 or 6%, whereas 1.8% was expected. And yet we know that something good has come out of it. 92 tons of gold was acquired by the Central Bank of Russia from local producers, which benefited our economy. We are decreasing our investment into the public debt of the US. We've almost sold out all of the treasury bills we had held. And These is an objective trend both in Russia and at international markets. I suggest we dive straight into it, into discussing. And the first question goes to Mr. Esko. When one talks to international business, to Europeans or to Americans, when one talks about sanctions or trade wars, everyone says that as of now, Russia is one of the strongest countries economically. And sanctions, they say, are used in order to steer the country into the desired direction, in order to influence it. For weak economies, sanctions are the greatest threat. What do you think, Mr. Esko? Do you really think that Russia is a strong or a weak player in the international arena? Is it worth trying to continue to talk to Russia from the point of view of economic pressure? What are the common interests between Russia and Finland, Russia and the EU? What do you think about all of this? Thank you. Mic to the speaker, please.
We were talking about trade wars in the current world, and some of the people with whom we talk in the West, in the European Union, in the United States, then mentioned that in majority of cases, the party which is suffering more from the trade wars and sanctions is the weaker economy. And my question was to you, as a European person, do you really trust that in the real world, Russia is such a weak economy that it would be the main object of, how to say, damage in the current trade wars and sanctions? And is there any sense in keeping this conversation going with Russia from the viewpoint of power? And do you think that Russia has got a lot to deal with together with European Union and Finland specifically? Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. I'm sorry, I was following the other discussion. I was a bit
What was it
surprised.
about?
I was surprised when I was listening because I didn't see any connection to the title we had. But it sometimes happens in conferences that the title is different and discussion is another story. So this is not always a big surprise. Anyway, first of all, you asked me about the impact of sanctions and counter-sanctions. So we have to keep in mind both aspects. I think the fact is that on the short term, both Russia and Europe are going to suffer from sanctions and counter-sanctions. The United States is not affected because of a very simple reason. Trade between the United States and Russia is very, very limited. It's not relevant for the U.S. economy. But for specific EU countries, member countries, these sanctions and counter-sanctions do have a role, and for Russia for sure. I think that on the short term, we have overestimated the impact of sanctions, so that in the Russian economy they say that it is roughly 0.5% of growth that has been lost. It is a lot, but it is not that much as maybe was expected in the beginning. But I think that from Russian perspective, this long-term perspective is more, let's say, concerning. When looking at Russia's urgent need to diversify its economy, to reduce the dependency on oil and gas and raw materials, and to increase investments in new technologies and technological sectors, this diversification will be much more difficult to be done when sanctions and counter-sanctions are there. And to be honest, I don't believe that this idea of trying to make things to happen in Russia more and more, so to reduce the interdependency, is on the longer term going to work. The only option for countries in the global economy is to collaborate with others and to specialize in certain sectors. Then I'd like to say something positive, and I think that in spite of these sanctions and counter-sanctions, as well as risk of trade war, I think we have to see this big picture. So if you take the longer period of time in the global economy, we have earlier had as well a situation when we have a multipolar world like we have today. So we have several big players in the global economy. But never before these big players have been that much dependent on each other. So interdependency between big players in the global market is higher than in any time before. We remember, and you remember very well, when we had this bipolar world. We had the U.S., the Soviet Union situation, and these two countries were not at all dependent on each others. But in today's world, if you look at Russia and the United States, or Russia and Europe, or China and the United States, interdependency is there. And that's why, in spite of all these challenges we face today, on the longer term, I'm optimistic that this urgent need to work together and to solve problems together as well will lead to a situation that let's say, collaboration will win.
Thank you. Спасибо большое.
Thank you very much. Did we manage to fix the translation channel? So right now we've distributed the equipment for simultaneous interpretation so that the participants could follow the discussion. The next question goes to Alex Rodzianko, maybe one of the most famous, notorious trade wars that triggered the establishment of the United States of America was the first trade war, when high tariffs were slapped on tea products in the British colonies, which resulted into an outcry, an outpouring. You remember the Boston Tea Party, Alexis? I think it was 1773. Back then, the Americans simply sank the whole batch of tea brought over from Britain by the British East Indian Company. But business is afraid of a war of sanctions because one action on the one side results in another, in a counter-sanction. In Russia, in May, there was a draft law introduced on counter-sanctions, but thanks to the Russian Union of Industrialists, this draft law was revisited and was made less harsh. What do you think? Do you think it is worth responding symmetrically to the sanctions and measures undertaken by the US? And what kind of risks is such an approach fraught with? Well, let's start from what you have begun from. Russia is not the strongest economy nor the biggest one, and therefore can come under pressure from outside that would result into changes in its political course. Well, I wouldn't call that something certain. So far, such attempts have failed. Yes, as compared to countries that introduce sanctions against Russia, such as the US or the EU, well, unlike these countries that have introduced sanctions, Russia is not responding symmetrically, and it's impossible. I think Russia has to understand what it's capable of and what its interests are. Russia shouldn't try to hurt the country that has introduced sanctions against it as much as it has hurt it. I don't know whether that is a satisfactory answer or the comprehensive one. But when sanctions were announced, we recommended to our colleagues in Russia, and we still do that, the following. The best way to counter sanctions is not counter sanctions or trying to hurt. No, the most efficient thing to do is to think about yourself, to improve your investment climate. The better the investment climate, the more investment there will be, the better off the economy. It was our recommendation, and it still is. And as for mirror actions, symmetric actions, well, you can talk about that, but it's all but impossible. And what about the American business? How does it respond to this situation as a whole? As far as I know, the American Chamber of Commerce is involved in a number of activities trying to assuage the situation. There are mutual visits, the Russian business coming to the US, talking to the Congress, to the State Department. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that. What is happening? Yes, indeed. Companies that are working in Russia are not happy about the sanctions. This is no good news for them. They have to look at their business. They have to observe these sanctions. They have no other choice. They have to reckon with the sanctions, which limits opportunities, which restricts their maneuver. So far, it's not that significant. And even though there are sanctions, they still can function, albeit with greater difficulty. But sanctions have more of a psychological effect. In what way? The more remote you are from Russia, the easier it is. And if there is a board of directors in the US and they read a headline in a newspaper, Russia is under sanctions, they do not go into that. And to go into detail, you've got to be closer to the subject, to Russia. And in the US, the board of directors simply think, well, if Russia is under sanctions, then we've got to be cautious, or let's wait. The companies that are working in Russia already, they go into details. They look at what they have to do in order to observe sanctions and the counter-sanctions too, how to work within these restrictions, and still continue to invest into their businesses. That is quite curious. When continuing these investments, they're very cautious. Usually, companies like to talk about their projects because it helps their capitalization. The greater the number of projects, the more interesting they are, the greater the capitalization of a company. If there is a good project established in Russia, these companies try to keep it under wraps, trying to not to talk about that, because they can be punished for these projects. And this is a psychological effect American companies feel. But not just American companies, Chinese ones too, and European ones too, because they have business in America and they understand that if something happens in one place, it can have bearing on their business at other places. Yes, I'm always worried when someone says Russia is under sanctions. No, just individuals are under sanctions, or some companies or sectors. Well, that is precisely the illustration of what I wanted to convey to you. If you do not go into detail, if you do not try to make you understand these things, then you simply do not understand the situation clearly. In order to understand what companies, what individuals are under sanctions, you've got to go into details.
Thank you. I have a question to the Russian business community. Alexei Repik, heading one of the biggest business communities, Delovaya Russia, and he's also CEO of Pharma. So, you know, sanctions have hit many of the Russian companies and entrepreneurs, even those who have no relation to Kremlin or to the Kremlin whatsoever, although it had been promised by the Westerners that measures would be taken against those who have a relation with the Kremlin. So major companies start re-registering, changing their ownership structure and doing other things. So do you think personally that there is a red light for the Russian business community in the US and Europe, and how can that impact on the exports and investment attraction? All those questions are not at all easy, and I cannot give an unambiguous answer, a straightforward answer. You know, the perception of sanctions, I want to say at the outset, is much more spooky than what is spelled out in the American and European regulators' documents. This is true, but at the same time, the point is that the bulk of the impact is about uncertainty. And, you know, sanctions are a demotivator for international investors to put up money in Russian markets and Russian sectors, and those sectors who turned out to be much more politically motivated than they used to be before. This is my first point. Second, will we have this red light forever? And there will be no windows of opportunity for the Russian business community. You know, the logic is simple. To ignore sanctions, you should be much, much better than all others, so that others couldn't do without you. And here, if our international colleagues see some unique, in terms of added value, proposition, they would definitely adopt a different stance while dealing with Russian businessmen. But when it's about competition, they start recalling toxicity of this jurisdiction and other token words that are used by the national mass media and Russian domestic mass media as well, adding fuel to flames. You started by asking me whether sanctions have a bearing on, you know, like the Russian saying says, to punish the innocent, to praise not those who were not involved. You know, when one is guided by patriotism, it's one thing, but when one thinks about some risks and threats in the first place, it's a different thing. Like, willing to develop an economy is a good thing, and it's, I believe, the proper economic patriotism. It's typical of the United States and Japan, by the by, and other markets and jurisdictions. So, you know, the sovereign discrimination in this context is, something that may overhaul the system of values in today's world. What spooks and frightens me, and what has frightened me over the past year, and I want us to entertain this, and probably our international colleagues also could be involved in the discussion, the American and European sanctions against the Russian Federation happen against companies. Last year, the United States adopted the Critical Technology Control Act, and now they consider all the state-of-the-art technology, artificial intelligence, biotech, genetics, and all other things. They put it into that notion of critical technology. So, now kinda some people may think about making the life of people better, which is good, but unfortunately we in this context may be separated by these sanctions, which will hinder the general progress of humankind. And with respect to international supply chains and added value chains, that will be detrimental for these. We will not be able to fully unlock the international cooperation potential, all of us. And what is happening right now, the protectionism gaining foothold and the new restrictions in place and turning inward, which are the trends of nowadays, and that is recognized by different business communities. And I thank my colleagues, both international and Russian, advocating for the business interests. I think we should keep trying to speak up, make our voice heard, advocating for the cooperation. We need that cooperation. Thank you, Alexei. What about your industry, your sector? How is pharma doing? Any restrictions, any difficulties in place? Well, on the one hand, it has become slightly easier for us. Not a single regulator or bureaucrat, even if it's a tough entity, would not assume the risk of being blamed for the deaths of innocent people that failed to receive some medicine. And in this context, we are covered by the backs of our final and end consumers. But you know what? The critical technologies I mentioned and the barriers to international technology exchanges directly deal a blow against our prospects, against our interests. We move forward, and make headway at a slower pace, or don't make headway at all. Otherwise, any other assessments would be a misstatement. Oh yeah, I agree with you, because all these are obvious and ridiculous and sad issues, like the visit of Mr. Rogozin that had been coordinated beforehand to discuss joint space programs between NASA and Roscosmos, and at a certain point of time they yielded to political pressure and withdrew the invitation. NASA. And that is painful for everybody, for those who are subject to sanctions and those who impose sanctions. Well, it's not about those countries or groups of countries. it is also detrimental for partner countries' interests. The attempts to encapsulate the technology development and turn inward, being on one's own, is kinda harks us back to the practices we had before in the Soviet times of all those closed laboratories with restricted access and special regime that we had in the Stalin times. And knowing your experience with WADA and RUSADA, Alexander, I must point out that we should do our best every day trying to break the ice. We shouldn't put up with this situation, and it's of critical importance for us to try to find common grounds between entrepreneurs and businessmen once states and governments fail to come to terms. We should have cultural, humanitarian, sports exchanges in place. In this case, I believe at the end of the day, the common sense would prevail, and if Roscosmos is more efficient in some areas and would be ready to help and aid NASA would seize these opportunities in the interests of all the humankind and all the Americans. And MIT now declines and rejects Sberbank, which is one of the major digital companies of Russia, and they have pulled out of the strategic partnership with Sberbank. Okay, yeah, the soft power meaning is very important. No one disputes that, and despite the World Economic Forum, still there will be a delegation from the Russian Federation attending that forum and working on the sidelines, speaking about Davos World Economic Forum. This is the platform that for the past 20 years has been talking globalization and merging markets and international exchanges, international multilateral institutions gaining ground. But unfortunately, in the past couple of years, we have seen a spate of deglobalization. Some international institutions stop being efficient and operational, like the WTO, sees many of the members breaching the norms and regulations by WTO. Such entities as OPEC start losing its members. Qatar has quit OPEC, and I have a question to Alexander Nobel. What threats do trade wars pose to the major international trade organizations like the WTO, and whether WTO can be a referee now that would reduce and curb the protectionism negative impact on the global markets? Thank you for your question. In the past couple of years, we have seen a crisis of international multilateral trading systems embodied by WTO and others. And this crisis has manifested itself in the past couple of years quite blatantly. But you know, the root causes go back deeper in the past couple of decades, and the world saw structural changes in those 2 or 3 decades. And the economists noted those, but these were kept under wraps, sort of. It wasn't discussed publicly, openly and broadly, and only at the start of the 21st century the emerging markets started catching up with the advanced economies, and the correlation between the advanced and developing countries was 60 to 40%, in the past and now currently. The emerging markets account for the bulk of the production globally and bulk of the GDP, industrial GDP. In the 20th century, the advanced countries were always ahead of the developing nations, despite some salient success cases. With the volatility in place, the stake of the developing countries did not grow, but in the past couple of decades, the developing and emerging markets obtained the dominance in GDP, in global GDP, and they now turn to be a source of foreign direct investments. Prior to that, the FDI flowed from the advanced countries to developing ones, but now the tide is turning, and in some cases, with FDI, emerging economies start prevailing. And the added value trade and added value goods and services crossing the border several times. We have seen the growth of that, and the economies are becoming more interdependent. What is of interest is that the changes that I noted and that took place in the past couple of years occurred in the context of the set of rules in trade established by the developed nations and serving the interests of those. So the rules of the game still favored the advanced economies. And that could be fine had it not been for the new clout and the new much greater weight of the emerging markets. Hence, the demand to change the rules of the games appeared. This is why the Doha round is in crisis, because multilateral liberalization is impeded. And now we can see the capsulization of regional trade agreements. At the same time, in the past decades, these structural incongruities piled up. The benefits from liberalization were unevenly distributed between global actors. Like between advanced and developing countries, the liberalization benefits were distributed unevenly between transnational corporations and consumers, as well, favoring the corporations. Even inside the developed countries, the benefits were distributed unevenly between high-skilled and low-skilled manpower. In the United States, there is a notion of jobless growth. The mid-income keeps growing, the average income keeps growing, but the median income is not, and that means that the low-skilled personnel was sidelined in the process of obtaining benefits of the liberalization and this feast of life. So this is why inside the United States there appeared some demands to uphold the interests of the low-skilled manpower and protect the uncompetitive sectors against emerging economies with cheap labor force. And between this is why now we see the differences between developed and developing countries like the United States and China. The US doesn't like the mandatory technology transfer that the Chinese demand. because the benefits obtained as a result of the cheaper labor and killing costs wouldn't make up for the losses stemming from the transfer of technology. And like in some sectors, like mineral ores extraction, we can see the rise of protectionism. And as a result of all all those differences and contradictions come to the fore now, hitting the international and multilateral trade system and WTO. But I wouldn't at the same time be downbeat about the WTO future, because all those measures imposed by some actors, including the US administration, when they impose some measures like this, they invoke 21st article of GATT and other things, pretending to be in line with the current set of rules and regulations and be within the multilateral system, though it may sound funny at some times. And in those cases where the WTO rules and norms are breached, well, these account for only 1/10 of all the transactions. So now the current goal is to preserve the WTO as a constraint to the uncontrolled growth of protectionism, at least. And at best, we would use WTO as a toolkit for further liberalizing trade and changing the rules of the game. I must say that we would get aware of the real value of the WTO only in case this system is destroyed. It's like public utilities and water supply system. We don't think of that when it works properly. If the sewage and the water supply are turned off, at this very instant we would understand their precious value. So the major global economic actors are not interested in destroying the WTO system, but what they want is to adjust it to their needs. And here they resort to the negotiations. And fortunately, it's not only about sitting at negotiating table, but rather trade wars at some times. Yeah, but the trade battles never stopped, though now they obtain new forms unseen before. I can't fancy a situation like 10 or 15 years ago when an ambassador of one country starts sending letters to companies of other countries saying that you may be subject to sanctions once you participate in some project. Like the American ambassador in Germany sent letters to German companies warning them that they would be subject to sanctions. I have a comment, okay, but then I'll ask Mr. Aho. I would probably make a comment and dispute that a bit. And there was another pipeline during Goita, Pamara, Uzhgorod, and the Reagan administration back then tried to threaten the Federal Republic of Germany. That was one of the transit countries, and the pipeline ran across their soil, but still at the end of the day was implemented. So we've seen this pressure before by the pressure by the United States. Okay, probably. Mr. Aho, the question to you, from the standpoint of the energy situation, current energy situation in Europe. Indeed, Europe, to a certain extent, to a large extent, is dependent on Russian gas and oil. At the same time, is trying to expand the list of suppliers, to diversify supplies. At this point of time, there is a rife debate about some new restrictions imposed against Russian energy projects, including inter alia Nord Stream 2. do you think that this situation subverts the energy security of Europe? I mean this new project, Nord Stream 2. Is it detrimental to Europe's energy security, to your mind? Or probably it's about some different standards, hidden agenda by the United States, trying to promote this hidden agenda. Do you think Europe needs Nord Stream 2, Mr. Aho? Thank you.
First of all, if you look at dependency, EU's dependency on Russian gas, the fact is that early 1990s, when the Soviet Union still existed, 70% of gas used in Western Europe was coming from the Soviet Union. Now the dependency is half of that, so it's below 40, it's something like 30, maybe 37% or something like that. So it has happened changes already. I have to say that critical view, the U.S. critical view on Nord Stream, I can put that into the, let's say, more commercial than political context. So it's a question of competition, because the U.S. is now a big player in the gas market again, because shale gas has increased capacity of the U.S. To produce LNG, and generally the role of the United States in energy market is totally different because of the shale revolution we have experienced. By the way, last year the U.S. oil production reached roughly the same level as Russia's capacity, which is a big change which has taken place within a few years. Secondly, I think it's very important to understand that there is that interdependency still, in spite of all these challenges we have discussed. So Europe needs Russian energy, oil and gas, minerals as well. That's a fact, and it's not going to be changed within short period of time. Even when Russia is trying to increase its exports to Asian market, pipelines are where they are, and that means that interdependency is going to stay. And in the same way, when looking at Russian trade with the European Union, before the Ukrainian crisis in 2013, the share of EU of Russian foreign trade was more or less 50%. So, and it's still very high, in spite of the fact that it's a bit lower than it was in 2013. But it has not dramatically changed since that. I think we have to keep in mind these facts in today's discussion. Sanctions are, and counter-sanctions are there, and I'm not optimistic that they will be lifted soon. We have to live with them. But outside sanctions, there are a lot of opportunities to work, and I think that what we have learned now is to work with these new limitations we have. But as I told, these practical examples are showing that interdependency has not disappeared, and it's still there. And I think we have potential to do something positive in these difficult circumstances.
But do we need Nord Stream 2 for Europe?
I think Nord Stream is needed. There is a business potential for that, and European companies are participating in that project. So it's needed in the European market, and I'm quite confident that that project will be finalized. It's already on the way, and construction is on the way. So I'm quite confident it will be finalized, in spite of the fact that Americans are putting some question marks.
Еще сразу вопрос к вам.
Another question to you in the light of discussions of the new round of sanctions, possible round of sanctions against Russia, and some people say that Russia may be disconnected from SWIFT banking and payment and exchange system. which would be a tough scenario, but we all recall the Iranian case. The EU, after Iran was subject to a very high level of sanctions, the EU said that we could not rely on our American partners no more, because they act at their discretion, do whatever they want, and that impacts our business, the interest of our companies. And the French said back then that they would call their companies to keep working with the Iranians, and the EU considered and contemplated an independent payment system and settlement system to be more independent from the United States. How do you see further developments in this area? Do you think that the EU would find ways to develop its own economy and support its companies in this new context when the United States pursue their own game, not taking into account the interests of the EU and its companies? Will the EU hedge its business community and its interests?
Mr. Esko, I address this question to you. Is the EU going to build a system to protect its business from the interests of the American business?
No, if you want me to reply on that. I think this sanction issue has got new dimension when this impact on third parties has come to the table, and I think that is something which is very creating a lot of risks for businesses everywhere in the world, because as long as sanctions or counter sanctions are predictable, so that you know exactly what the rules of the game are, you can make plans, you can survive with them, but if you don't know beforehand if you are doing things which are acceptable or not, that makes business opportunities very, very complicated. And I can see that this interpretation of Iranian sanctions includes that kind of risk. My final comment: I think fundamental issue is the fact that because of many reasons, there are governments almost every corner of the world who believe that it's in their interest to move from rule-based systems which have prevailed since the end of the Second World War, to move from those rules into deals. And it's not only American phenomenon. This deal-making interest is almost every corner in the world. I'm coming from a small country, and we feel that this is a huge risk for all if we start to believe that instead of rules we need deals made with different parties. That's why I think that the only way for business to survive in that global environment, new global environment, is to protect rule-based system and to ask governments everywhere to follow the rules and commitments they have made. I think this is a very, very fundamental issue, and business community has a global role to play in that. I'm also a board member of the ICC, International Chamber of Commerce, and I have to say that international business community has not been active enough in protecting these common interests, because business interest is to have predictable rules, and our voice should be stronger in that context.
Спасибо большое. Alex,
Thank you very much, Alex. I've got a question that I'll address to you. You talk to American business, to Russian business, to politicians, to economists. Are there any sectors of the economy left that still have very good opportunities for the development of relations between Russia and the US from the economic point of view? Are there any sectors where companies still invest, try to profit? Because it seems as if in many sectors, if not in all of them, contacts have been all but shut down. Well, it might seem that all the opportunities, all the prospects have collapsed. But it gets me back to what I told you about headlines in newspapers and the discrepancy between what you read in newspapers and what you see in reality if you look into it. You know, as head of the American Chamber of Commerce, I had to very often answer questions at different roundtables since 2013. Europeans, Russians pointed at me and they said that the US forces Europeans to introduce sanctions. It doesn't cost anything to the US because the US doesn't have any American businesses represented in Russia, any projects, any investment. And Europeans said that they always bear the brunt of these sanctions. I think that it's a very strange argument because my Chamber of Commerce has 500 companies, one of the biggest in the world, and they've got business in Russia too. And it's almost impossible to live in Russia without encountering American products or American goods. McDonald's, KFC, Ford automobiles, many other things. They are ubiquitous. And the investment stands at around $10 billion since the establishment of the Russian Federation. Yes, that's not that big, but at least Pepsi-Cola has invested around $10 billion into the Russian economy on its own. But where do McDonald's and Fords come from? How is it possible when the investment level is so small? The thing is, American companies are multinationals. They invest not just from the United States of America, but from other countries too. And if you have been following the tax policy of the US over the recent years, especially if you've followed the corporate tax, then you might have noticed that the corporate tax in the US is very high, at 35% or so, and that's not competitive as compared to the average across the world. It's 20–25% across the world. And that means that American companies that make money abroad have not been getting back that money to the US. Otherwise, they would have had to pay the 35% tax. And they have lined their pockets abroad. But they didn't simply have this money on their accounts. Very often they put that money to work within these companies investing abroad. We decided to conduct a survey among our companies in order to understand what kind of business they had in Russia and what their plans were with regard to these businesses. And incidentally, Alexander, we've been doing that for the last 2 years together with you. What was the outcome of this survey? We got response only from 80 companies. They have invested in Russia more than $80 billion, which is 8 times as much as the official statistics tells us. Second question was, are you trading with Russia through third countries or through US? And the response was 3/4 of all the trade, 35% is made through the third countries. So you've got to take the official statistics about the trade between Russia and the US and you have to multiply it by 4, and then you'll get the real number of how close the American Russian companies are. And that can be compatible with the trade between Russia and the EU. And that is bigger than the trade between Russia and any separate individual country of the EU. And what about the investment? That was the third question over the last year. And it was big, around $3-4 billion each last year. And that means that the companies are still working in Russia, nor do they think that the Russian market is not a promising one. And lastly, these activities are spread across a wide array of sectors. There are different companies involved. That sell consumer goods, energy companies such as Esko or Chevron that invest enormous sums into Russia, automobile companies, infrastructure companies such as General Electric, and the like. So the answer is simple. Russia continues to be a promising market, all the sanctions notwithstanding. And the companies still have a leeway to work in Russia. Yes, sanctions are a hindrance. No one is happy about sanctions. But Russia is very interesting to the American business and to American companies. Thank you very much. My next question goes to Alexei. It's no secret that the American markets are growing at a rapid pace. In a decade or so, it's going to have many new middle-income representatives, and that means that it is going to change the structure. And I talked to Asia. It is growing at a rapid pace. And they think that Europe is like Disneyland for adults. The Asians come to Europe, there is tourism, there are museums. But that is the first thing they say, not the economy. They view Europe as some sort of a spiritual recreation center. Alexei, right now you are developing your ties very fast with Japan, with Asian markets. Mitsui bought a 10% stake at our farm some time ago. You've got many other projects. You're going to supply some technical equipment and some other things to Asia. Abrao Jurso champagne, I think. So you are entering the Asian market very actively. Could you tell us a little bit more about your trade and economic cooperation with Asian markets? Are there any difficulties that you see, you perceive, or is everything going smoothly? Well, Alexander, it is very bitter of you to remind us after the New Year holidays about gastronomic tourism and restaurants. But I'd like to make a connection between what we have been speaking about previously. It's no secret that many countries, both European ones and Asian ones, like Japan we're talking about, are virtually pursuing a foreign policy and an economic policy walking in the wake of the United States of America. And many in Russia are crying out, why are you doing that? Where is your sovereignty, your independence? Well, the thing is, the US is not trying to force that. They're not intimidating or menacing anyone. No, it's just a conscientious policy. Well, the thing is, this is just the economic reality that makes country do that. In this context, this paradigm of choosing a market and business over an independent position of its own is widespread. The US is still dominant in terms of the strength of its economy and its market share. But the question is about the current cycle. Right now, the US started to think about protecting their own enterprises, their jobs. The Americans are paying for the global security, so to speak. That's what they think. And they want to have their efforts reimbursed, at least partly. So the Europeans and others rethink their old paradigm, trying to choose independence. And there's nothing bad about that. That's just the logic of negotiation. I would like to say that right now, regrettably, one of the elements that forces countries to abandon global instruments such as WTO to choose Mercosur or the new Silk Road or a bilateral project is the fact that many of our decision makers, many politicians are seeing this new reality. So, in other words, this is just the new reality that we are viewing, and we see that universal structures, global structures are being relegated to the background, whereas regional organizations are coming to the foreground. Amid all of this, still Russia is going forward, like in our relations with China, when we've hit the 100 billion benchmark which we planned. What does it entail for our relations with other Asian countries? Not just between Russia and China, but between Russia and other countries. We are planning diversification. And in that regard, the opportunities presented by South Korea and Japan, or our traditional partner, Vietnam, and these diversification opportunities become increasingly important, like with Vietnam, with which we have already struck a free trade agreement. We see this shift and the focus and the emphasis, and we start to think whether this eastward turn is going to be a long-term policy that Russia is going to pursue. I don't know. I think that as far as many big projects are concerned, this eastward turn is going to be relevant for quite a long time. Like in the case of infrastructure projects, the pipelines that have already been built, whatever the circumstances, they are going to continue to function. They're going to yield a long-term effect, even if in the short term we see some fluctuations. Yes, the world is changing fast, and there are some sectors where changes can be faster. But the thing is, I don't think that there are going to be big trends, because it is up to each and every company on an individual basis to choose the vector. And those companies will be more successful, that are going to be more adaptable, that are going to be able to adjust as fast as possible to the ever-changing external factors. However strange that might seem, these are good times for entrepreneurship. Sanctions, trade wars pose a challenge that help the spirit of entrepreneurship to bloom and to thrive, the ability to adapt, to respond quickly to the ever-changing circumstances. These capabilities become ever more required, ever more needed. Amid all of this uncertainty, a human being and their role in history and economics becomes very important. It is prepared to the forefront. And that is why this eastward turn in Russia has happened, because we have this Russian spirit of being able to adjust, to adapt. We have a very young generation of entrepreneurs, and they know how to respond fast to challenges, however unpredictable, however surprising they are. Yes, we'll follow this situation in 2019 and beyond, and I think this is going to be discussed at the Gaidar Forum. Very interesting topic. Thank you. Alec, you mentioned this year and other, and I've got a question to Alexander. You're an expert. What do you think about the future of world trade? What is going to happen within the next 3 years? Thank you very much for the question. It is absolutely evident that in the coming 2 to 3 years, the countries will feel the consequences of the decisions enacted in 2018. And that is the easiest thing to forecast because it has already happened. According to the estimates and the calculations that we make together with the Russian Foreign Trade Academy, we have seen a number of important decisions. Yes, there have also been statements, but the decisions is what matters here. Like the one you have mentioned, the tariffs slapped by the Americans on the Chinese goods, the tariffs on metals, on aluminium. And according to our calculations, the world GDP growth is going to lose around 1 percentage point, that is around $80 billion. The first countries to suffer are the US and China, around $50 billion each. Maybe for these two countries that's not that big, but right now that countries are fighting for each and every percentage point of their GDP growth, even that amount matters. As far as Russia is concerned, what are the consequences going to be for our country? If we look at the metal tariffs trade war, then we can say that Russia will stand to suffer, to feel the negative consequences. But the greatest amount of negative consequences is going to be felt not due to the decisions by the US administration. We're going to suffer due to the responses undertaken by other countries to the American decisions. Turkey and the European market are far more important to us, and the countermeasures introduced by these two players to limit the imports of ferrous and non-ferrous metals from all the world, including Russia, these measures are going to have a negative impact upon Russia. According to our calculations, the American decision will cost us around $100 million on an annual basis. But if you factor in the decisions of Europe and Turkey, it's going to be another $500 million dollars. And this trend is going to continue for some time, and the consequences will be felt too. And there are three scenarios that we can see. At the entrance, you see the report, Trade and Globalization. We try to speak in greater detail about all of that. We have the optimistic scenario, the conservative scenario, and the negative. The negative scenario says that everything is going to collapse, the world is going to slide down into total protectionism, like what we saw after the Great Slump, the Great Depression. The positive scenario tells us that everyone is going to be able to come to an agreement and that the WTO rules are going to be rewritten and everything is going to be settled through this mechanism. But I think the gold mean is what the path that the world is going to follow. The conservative scenario says that the balance is going to be struck. The WTO is going to address two major issues. It'll have a trade disputes settlement mechanism, and as far as the current decisions are concerned, they are probably not going to be abolished or annulled, but they're still going to be settled through the WTO mechanism. And another major issue is probably going to be addressed through the WTO in this conservative scenario. That is the notification procedure. When countries warn one another and everyone else of protective measures that they resort to. Right now, the notification procedure is all but dead. Countries are simply trying to introduce such protective measures in a clandestine manner. We can see a certain difference. Trade wars, we can say, are economic instruments trying to change the economic conduct of your partner, whereas sanctions are an economic instrument with the aim to change the political behavior of your partner. And there is a difference. But as far as Russia is concerned, I believe we should look to Chinese experience. In the 1980s, sanctions were slapped on China. But back then, if we compare the US and the Chinese GDP, we'll see that the situation was very similar to the one Russia and the US right now. But they decided not to respond symmetrically or asymmetrically. They wanted to be as open as possible. And that is how they managed to get out of this snag, through attracting investment, through improving the climate, the business climate. That is what China did. Now, as for sanctions, it's not the sanctions per se that create problems. It's the uncertainty around the possibility of future changes to the regime of sanctions. The most conducive period for the Russian economy was from the fourth quarter 2016 to the third quarter 2017. That was the best period because the growth rates were highest and the investment levels recovered to the pre-crisis level. That was when the sanctions regime stabilized. The countries that had been introduced sort of stagnated. There were no new sanctions, and everyone had already got accustomed to those sanctions. But starting from late 2017, all this talk started about the Kremlin lists. And right now, Americans even say that every 2 or 3 months, they have to announce new sanctions. They understand what they are talking about. It is precisely the announcement of new sanctions that fuels this uncertainty. And this uncertainty entails risks involved in investing into the Russian economy. It has a negative impact upon the Russian ruble, and it breeds the under appreciation of the Russian ruble. It is precisely due to this uncertainty of sanctions. Ruble is weaker to dollar than it could be, but it is precisely what helps Russia secure an additional transfer to the government and to the ruling class. The sanctions amid these conditions do not prevent any exports of Russian goods, and that is why we have a surplus of our budget. It could exist still, but it would have been smaller, and that is due to the pressure because of the sanctions. It has an appreciative effect to the dollar and a depreciative to the ruble.
Same refers to major enterprises and the impact there too. All those trade wars that I distinguish from the sanctions are more probably predictable, and after a round or two of squabbles and spats, countries would start incrementally but surely negotiating the new set of rules. But with respect to the sanctions pressure put on the Russian economy and the Russian ruble, it's much less predictable because it's wholly politically motivated. And in this case, the Russian positive external economic agenda would not disappear. And we have a report here, external economic activities as a backbone for economic growth. So it's going to be okay at the end of the day. I'm not saying it's going to be okay and we'll have a happy end. We will have a happy end in the external trade and foreign economic area if we act as we should act, as is appropriate. Okay, thank you. We are nearing the end of our session. We can only accept one question. Will you introduce yourself? We'll fetch a portable mic. Evgeny Mihalenko, System Management Association. My question is to all those attending. Don't you have an impression that at the outset, since the very outset, the sanctions case did not receive a proper response from Russia? Now we started struggling. Who defeats whom? It's the tug of war. We should have acted otherwise. Like, guys, you impose sanctions. Okay, we offer a tax haven to your business, we should have said. I work a lot, and I used to work quite a lot with America, and I know how the decisions are made. The Americans would destroy anything that prevents them from earning money, and it's lobbyism paid by huge corporations that decides on the foreign policy. If major corporations would see some jurisdiction as a source of income, the foreign policy would change. So we got involved in this tug of war, and we cannot win in this struggle. We ought to have conducted ourselves in a different fashion. We should have provided favorable context to the American companies. We should have approached from the other side. We shouldn't have balked and kicked against the pricks, because they probably are stronger than us. We should have provided more favorable economic and of business conditions. We have two or probably three panelists that want to comment upon that. Probably Mr. Aho.
discussion about sanctions, counter-sanctions, trade wars. Do you think that it's a bit more general phenomenon that everyone wants to find somebody to blame because of the fact that they have internal problems? Americans do like that, Russians like to do that, Chinese as well doing the same, Turkey. Many countries do have now internal problems because of many reasons. Technological development is very fast, transition of economies is very, very fast, and I'm afraid that now we are starting to destroy very fundamental elements in the global economy only because of the fact that everyone believes that external problems are actually the most crucial ones for us. Italy in Europe is blaming the European Union and saying that Italy is not doing well because of the European Union. To be honest, Italy is doing bad because of Italy, because of Italian mistakes they have made. And I think we have to get out of that mindset and to concentrate our internal problems. I think Americans do have a lot of problems which are not linked to China or Russia or Europe. They are internal problems in the United States, and they have to concentrate into those problems. But now they are trying to say that it's because of other outside world we are in this kind of difficult situation. Looking at China, you are saying that China is a better option for you than the United States. I'm not sure about that. China is going to be dominant player in the global economy, and it wants to have its own rules as well. That's why, as coming from a small country, I think that we all have to concentrate to get business community globally to be active and strongly promoting common rules and also strict implementation of these rules. I think this is the common interest, and this is why we have been doing so well in the world, that we had these rules and we applied them until now. Let's try to protect them, because that's the only way how the world is able to prosper in the future.
Спасибо, Алексей.
Ну, я скажу так.
Thank you, Alexei. Well, in my opinion, the Russian government did what you suggested, actually, but you know, one cannot ignore the emotional sentiment and response coming from the people, the feedback of the people, and at the same time it was a very sly means to distract people from the domestic issues and problems, as you mentioned, Mr. Aho. It was like, well, the optimal response would be to improve your own domestic conditions of doing business, your own domestic economy, to the utmost, to the best of our ability. And what does the Russian business community think? I'll bet they wouldn't do otherwise. They would, you know, the Russian Federation started responding in kind to those things that we probably could stop short of responding. I recall President Putin's meeting business community several years ago. It was proposed to establish a most favorable regime inside the country for our own companies and for providing better living standards for our people and improving our jurisdiction. But there is one, it is all clear, but there is one point. That apart from the starkness of the global diplomacy and diplomats, like, it might be beneficial for Russia to abolish visas and open borders for Americans, Europeans, Japanese and others. But we don't do that. We respond, we reciprocate, we respond in kind. We act in the tit-for-tat fashion, and although this fan ID at the World Cup was a very good practice and a good example, and it allowed Russian tourist infrastructure to deliver very good results, the unmatched results, and the tourism sector has grown considerably and may outpace the arms exports or agriculture in terms of economic growth rate. But we don't have much in our toolkit. Opening up fully sometimes means losing your economic sovereignty. If your size, if your dimensions are not too big, I mean economically. Let's be frank. The main point for the economy, competition-wise, is being able to generate added value on our own, not only being part of the supply chain in the lower end. We should look for and find our own promising solutions. You know, it would be difficult to increase foreign investments several-fold in the current context, because everybody who wanted to be here, is already here. Probably we should think of something novel. And at the same time, we should share with what we are good at currently, if we want to open up wholly. And in this context, well, being a farmer person, I want to tell you that every now and then everybody should ail a bit or catch a cold to be healthy, generally. So, to enhance your immunity, etc. But you know, we all need sanctions and trade wars to get stronger and better, although it's not too gratifying to live within these periods of trade wars and change. But probably the solution would be kind of trying to separate the less efficient from the more efficient, distinguish between them. Well, at the same time, I reiterate, I came up with a different option, a more optimistic and a positive one. But still, we should learn to live in this context. Let's wait and see what happens within several years. Sometimes, if you demonstrate strength, you know, it would be then easier for you to be flexible in the negotiations that follow. You know, you mentioned the Chinese option, although we have our own peculiarities. We should separate economy from the politics. We should provide the maximum, the best context for our economic actors, for business actors. We should provide the best possible conditions for doing business, for pursuing economic activities. You know, when the sanctions wars started, our political discourse had a notion of liberalizing to counter the sanctions. I think that at the end of the day, we will end up with this, opting for this variant. Like creating the lobbying structures that would lobby against toughening of sanctions would kinda gradually reduce and diffuse the tensions. Anyway, we should create favorable conditions, as I said, and we had another report called Sanctions in earnest and for good. But we will have all those reports of ours in public access shortly. Thank you. We'll read all those reports of yours. But you know, it's time we finished the discussion. We should wind up. I thank all the participants of the conversation and today's panel. We will have many more panels today. We'll see you in the course of the day. Thank you.